In this presentation, we're going to emphasize the notions shown here. And this is sort of an advertisement for you to know what to expect. And if you do not understand some of these terms, then it will facilitate your attention to what is going to be illustrated. Many of these notions are disseminated across companion websites. In this instance, we're going to be speaking of a believe it or not story which is included in the Clinical Eye Openers website. Here is a website dedicated to terminology. This is a website dedicated to what is known about particular syndromes, causes, and mechanisms in brief. This is a database concerning teratogens, and then this speaks of our program, in particular implementations in Ukraine. And when we invoke the notion dysmorphology, then many perspectives emerge with such assertion. Dysmorphology is a manifestation of alterations of development due to environmental and genetic factors. That is the science of teratology. And in order to become aware, there's a transition from observing something, being awake, having open eyes, understanding what a signal is, that is a sign that we understand is metamorphosed into a signal, being able to realize that signals can cluster, and if they do so consistently, then they may be indicative of a syndrome or a constellation of signals. These then in turn have a cause and independently have a mode of expression. One cause can express different ways, or many causes can manifest the same way in physical syndromic features. All of that can be then synthesized in what we call diagnosis. And diagnosis is hypothetical. There is no such thing in existence. It is just plain a suggestion of how to understand the etiology, its pathways of manifestation, and the consistency of these manifestations as signals, which are then linked to specific signs. And all of this is connected with the natural history. That is, what is the expected evolution of such a disorder? And when a natural history contradicts the diagnosis, it is invariably indicative that the diagnosis is wrong. So this pathway includes many stations where we stopped. Clinical genetics then is the ability to detect signs and signals due to genomic alterations. It's a subset of teratology. One has to be aware of what others know in order to interpret signs as signals, or do its own research, like in this believe it or not stories. All of this becomes memorable to the extent that we have clear definitions and clear open eyes. We foster that with clinical videos and photo galleries because the only way, for instance, to recognize a face is to see it. There's no way we are going to recognize an individual by talking about it. Then we need to link the visual with a form of communication, which generally is verbal. So we need a nomenclature, we need a terminology. And all of this requires a perspective of what's the cause, how is the cause manifested, which pathways does it follow, how can it be synthesized, and how is then the significance with the transit of time. In a manner of speaking, the itinerary of this believe it or not story starts with a face, which then suggests it is a facies. And once we acquire certain degree of confidence, then our observations then challenge a dogma. And as the observations become hard facts, they are conducive to a synthesis of what appears to be a relatively new or nascent dysmorphology syndrome. And again, in a manner of speaking, this is our raw material. We show here 3 of 6 patients, their faces. We ask the question, is this a facies? In other words, do these faces speak to us about something? And the dysmorphic features associated in other components of the morphogenesis. That is what we could see of what's left of the creation of shapes when individuals become fetuses as the embryo differentiates. So again, we have the same sequence. But in clinical eye openers, we emphasize in this story in particular the process of synthesis. We are not speaking here of the pathology, treatment, and so forth because of the interest in being brief. And if you like to know how we interpret this raw material, here are the legends that, and you can stop the motion and read it for as long as you wish. This is then the basis of why we think that this, believe it or not, medical story is of interest in the perspective of how we synthesize what appear to be a relatively new dysmorphic syndrome. So before we start, I should call your attention to some of the key notions or term and terminologies that we will be touching upon. First of all, the face is stigmatic, meaning it's a facies. There is element of atresia or hypoplasia, that is arrested development. There are components of the ear known as helix antihelix, of the face, the maxilla, and other components of the face, and how these realities can destroy a dogma or the assumption that something is truth without proof, and how it was considered dogmatically that any loss of autosomal genes was inherently fatal and lethal. And you just saw the face of an individual with such phenomenon. And then the expansion of clinical sciences toward other disciplines, dermatoglyphics, that may be of interest to you. That is the fingerprintology, if you like, or fingerprints in the police sense, and a little bit of a story of bonding upon which much of the medical ethics rests. And being a clinician, the first question, at least I have, is this a normal face? Yes? No? Or perhaps? And if I am hesitant about normal, but not sure, is it dysmorphic? Is it typical of something? And if so, is it a facies? And if it is a facies, does it speak of a syndrome or a diagnosis? Those are the questions that most clinicians specialized in dysmorphology ask themselves. And again, why? Because the pursuit of reality tends to clean away all sorts of dogmas. And as we investigated the possibility that the face is stigmatic and searched for others, and we found them, then we felt that perhaps this was a nascent opportunity to define a syndrome. And what follows is a short story of how a syndrome known as the 18q minus syndrome became documented. And once we were certain from having investigated several patients that this was a consistent, persistent clinical pattern, then it became science, the clinical scientific proof associated with chromosomal analysis that sustained the view that it was a partial deletion of genes on the long arm of chromosome 18 justified a formal report. And as the saying that victories bring victories, so it is in the world of clinical investigations. Once we identified this syndrome, then additional observations were reported. In the studies of the volar skin, that is volante, meaning flying, that's the skin for the primates to grasp, mainly simians, but also other animals that have prehensible tails. And what we have on our volar skin of the palm and feet, we have dermal patterns or glyphs of considerable interest to investigators of biology. Another expansion was toward an investigation of the morphogenesis of the brain. This was not possible except that a particular strong bonding existed between our clinical role and the humanism of the family and the patient. And as we alluded a minute ago, when new facts are discovered, very often they destroy existing dogmas. In this instance, the dogma sustained, as mentioned earlier, that a significant loss of autosomal genes sufficiently extensive to be detectable by chromosomal analysis was lethal in nature. In other words, it was not compatible with survival of the fetus. In other words, again, that term is teratothanasia, anomalies that cause death. We also mentioned that the victory led to other victories and that we were able to perform investigations not only of the morphogenesis of the body as we can see it, but of the morphogenesis of the brain. We said that was only possible because of the strong bonding between the clinical and the humanitarian attitude of the patient and his parents. It was decided very early on, over the first decade of interactions between the clinician and the family and patient, that they were very interested in contributing to science. And when T.S. unexpectedly died, it was a given that the parents requested studies of the morphogenesis of his brain. And not only that, they also requested that he rest forever in the city where the clinician resided. Let this stand in memory of T.S. and as a documentation of the importance of the medical bonding between the clinical and the humanitarian aspects of the practice of medicine. And we have reached the end of this, believe it or not, story. On the left is shown an index of key terms and notions that we touched upon. Should you need a reminder, please view the video again or visit our companion websites, in particular the clinical eye-openers, where this, believe it or not, story is one of the features. But you can visit the Pandora Word Box for Terminology, or EBIS, which stands for International Birth Defects Information System, and look up certain components of this index. So thank you very much for your attention. Please visit us again soon. And until then, again, please accept my best wishes.